On a winter night in December of 1938, the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel in New York glittered like a palace. Beneath the chandeliers, a 17-year-old girl descended the grand staircase, wearing a pale pink satin gown, strapless, unadorned by tiara, the new line of Mainbocher that would set fashion pages aflame. The camera's flashbulbs popped as if a constellation had burst overhead, and the press christened her the glamour girl of the century. For one breathless evening, Brenda Frazier seemed to embody the promise of youth, beauty, and the hope that even in the shadow of the Great Depression, America could still produce a fairy tale debutante. But fairy tales have their own kind of cruelty. Few in that dazzling ballroom knew the girl in the pink satin gown had spent the week starving herself to fit the dress, or that she was running a fever as she smiled and danced before the crowds. Fewer still guessed that this night, the one that was supposed to launch her into a charmed life, would instead become the first act of a long tragedy. History remembers the headlines and the photographs. It seldom remembers the cost. Behind the champagne toasts, Brenda was a child raised as a prize to be displayed, not a daughter to be cherished. That unspoken wound would haunt her, shaping her choices in love, marriage, and motherhood, and in time would pass, like an inheritance of grief, to her own child. This is Old Time Docs. Tonight, we peel back the myths and return to that glittering ballroom, not to celebrate the triumph of a debutante, but to ask a harder question. How does a society's dream of beauty turn into the lifelong burden of one young woman? The Waldorf-Astoria that night was more than a ballroom. It was the stage upon which America projected its longing for renewal after the long years of the Depression. Beneath the blaze of crystal chandeliers and the scent of gardenias, the city's most powerful families gathered: bankers and publishers, café society doyens and young men in white tie, all craning their necks to see the girl in the pale pink satin gown. Brenda Frazier, barely 17, walked down the grand staircase with the tentative grace of a swan pushed into flight too soon. Her strapless Mainbocher gown, unadorned by jewels except for a modest string of pearls, that was meant to appear simple, yet made her the center of every camera's gaze. That season, young women across the country would ask their dressmakers for the Brenda neckline, as though wearing it might lend them her aura. The press loved the story, the pretty girl who had stepped out of the long shadow of the Great Depression to revive the glitter of New York's café society. Life magazine put her on its cover. Gossip columns chronicled her every waltz and smile. To the crowd, she seemed the embodiment of hope itself, that wealth and youth, elegance and optimism could still hold the nation spellbound. Yet if one had looked closely, one might have noticed her pallor beneath the powder, the stiffness in her smile. Brenda had been ill with fever, but more than that, she was desperately hungry. She had starved herself for days to keep her waist small enough for the gown. As the orchestra played, and she danced, the applause felt like a command. She had no choice but to obey. There was an old paradox at play in that ballroom. To the guests, this debutante season was a glamorous rite of passage. To Brenda, it was the culmination of years of relentless preparation diets that began in childhood, lessons in posture, the sense that her worth depended entirely on being beautiful and pleasing. Even as the cameras flashed, she was a frightened girl performing a role scripted by others. Her ambitious mother, the society that prized debutantes as trophies, the newspapers hungry for a new face to sell on their front pages. Older viewers today may remember other young women who seemed to live out the same tale. Decades later, a shy kindergarten teacher named Diana Spencer would be thrust into a royal fairy tale and discover that public adoration could be as suffocating as a gilded cage. In our own time, we have watched women married into power, admired, judged, dissected in the press as if they were symbols rather than individuals. That night at the Waldorf-Astoria, Brenda was the first to walk that particular path, and she walked it in satin shoes that already pinched. For one glittering evening, the world saw a princess of the ballroom. In truth, a long-sown tragedy had only just stepped into the light. Long before the flashbulbs of that December night, Brenda Frazier had been a child passed back and forth like a contested prize. She was born in June of 1921 to a family whose fortunes had once been secure, but whose unity had frayed long before her first steps. Her father, Frank Frazier, a man of old Boston money, was distant and soon absent. Her mother, known in society as Big Brenda, was ambitious yet embittered, a beauty of an earlier generation whose own dreams of marrying into secure power had soured in divorce. When the marriage collapsed, the fight over their little girl became less about affection and more about prestige and leverage. In an era when wealthy couples often treated children as extensions of their estates, custody was decided by bank accounts and social connections rather than the tenderness of a parent's heart. The courts awarded the girl to her mother, but the mother rarely raised her. Brenda spent much of her early life in the care of nannies, boarding schools, and, at times, the chilly presence of her formidable grandmother, Lady Jane. These women could enforce discipline, but they offered little warmth. The child learned early that a smile could please the adults, that good posture and neatness brought approval, and that love, the unconditional kind, was not part of the bargain. It was an unspoken lesson. To be noticed, one must be decorative. To be safe, one must be compliant. This pattern, what modern psychologists call generational trauma, is not unique to the Fraziers. A wound of neglect in one generation often hardens into ambition in the next, and that ambition may in turn shape the child into something to be displayed rather than nurtured. Brenda's mother believed she was giving her daughter a chance to succeed in a world where beauty and charm opened doors. In truth, she was repeating her own wound, trying to reclaim through the girl what she had lost. The little girl grew up never quite certain whether she was loved or merely groomed. For older viewers who recall the troubled early years of Princess Diana, another young girl molded for a role she did not choose, the echoes are hard to miss. Both were children who craved affection, but were instead prepared for presentation. And though Diana's era offered more public sympathy than Brenda's, the underlying expectation that a young woman's value lay in her appearance, and her marriage had changed little. By the time Brenda entered her teens, she already understood the terms of her existence. She was to be pretty, polite, obedient, ready to be admired and chosen. In a sense, the famous debutante ball at the Waldorf-Astoria was not the beginning of her performance, but its grand unveiling. The world would later wonder how the glamorous girl of 1938 could have unraveled so painfully. The answer lay in the lonely years before the cameras ever found her. In the winter season of 1938, the machinery of New York's cafe society shifted into high gear. Newspapers mapped out the coming-out parties as if they were royal pageants, and Brenda Frazier was the undisputed star. To the public, this was merely an old tradition renewed, the debutante ball, in which the daughters of prominent families were formally presented to society. Yet by the late 1930s, the ritual had taken on a new gloss. It was no longer just a family occasion. It had become a national spectacle, amplified by radio, newsreels, and glossy magazines. Brenda embodied the new style. She had the kind of delicate oval face and wide-set eyes that reproduced well in photographs. And Mainbocher's decision to dress her in a strapless satin gown without tiara was a bold break from the stiff Edwardian image of the debutante. The fashion pages called it modern. Other young women simply copied it, and a trend was born. Behind the glamour, however, there was calculation. Café society thrived on novelty and on the illusion that the old world of inherited fortunes could renew itself with fresh young beauties. Brenda was both the symbol and the sacrifice of that illusion. Her schedule in that season was relentless. Teas, luncheons, fittings, balls. She was often feverish and faint from strict dieting, determined to keep her waist small enough for the bodices designed to show off her fragile shoulders. The world applauded her grace, unaware that she was quietly suffering the early signs of an eating disorder that would shadow her life. The glittering photographs in Life and Vogue made her seem untouchable. In truth, she was a teenager, being squeezed into a part written for her by a society that valued her as much for her fragility as for her charm. Older viewers may remember that 4 decades later, the same spectacle played out on a grander, more international scale, with the wedding of Lady Diana Spencer to the Prince of Wales. A young woman, chosen as the ideal bride for her image of innocence, suddenly found herself the focus of a global gaze. What changed in the intervening years was the size of the audience. What did not change was the expectation that the woman's private self could be subsumed into a public symbol. In our own time, the stage has shifted again to the endless feed of social media, where so-called influencer brides are curated for public consumption in much the same way. Brenda was the first American debutante to be treated as a celebrity rather than simply as a young woman of her class. That new status was a mixed blessing. It offered the fleeting thrill of stardom but imposed the kind of scrutiny once reserved for actresses and opera divas. The price was invisibility of the self. The pink satin gown and the flashbulbs promised a fairy tale. Beneath them stood a girl whose smile hid hunger and fear, and whose life would soon show how dangerous it can be to confuse a public image with a private soul. The glow of the debutante season had scarcely dimmed when Brenda Frazier was swept into another ritual of her world, the search for a husband worthy of her fame. The newspapers spoke of her as though she were a prize to be claimed, and the names floated around her were the sons of financiers, shipping heirs, even a few minor European nobles. But what caught Brenda's eye, and the public's imagination, was a figure who seemed to stand apart from the stiff manners of her social set. John Sims, Shipwreck Kelly. Shipwreck, as he had been nicknamed for his daring plays on the football field at Yale, was handsome in a way that felt more approachable than the polished airs of Wall Street. He had a square, confident grin and a certain easy charm, the sort of man who could swap stories with sports writers as comfortably as he could dance at the Stork Club. For Brenda, who had spent her life under the sharp eyes of her ambitious mother and the judgment of society editors, his casual good humor was disarming. He seemed to see not merely the poised debutante, but the shy girl beneath the satin gown. Their first meeting was orchestrated by mutual friends at one of the Café Society luncheons, and it was said that Brenda, usually guarded in company, laughed more freely that afternoon than anyone had heard her do in years. Shipwreck had the gift of making her feel momentarily unstudied. He teased her gently about the headlines, confessed his own unease at being a tabloid darling after his football glory, and treated her as though she were a girl to be courted, not a society trophy to be displayed. The gossip columns, of course, devoured the story. A sports hero and America's most celebrated debutante. It had the flavor of a modern fairy tale, an alliance of two worlds, the glamorous athletic celebrity and the delicate socialite. For a time, the courtship provided Brenda a reprieve from the relentless demands of image. Shipwreck took her to ball games, to small dinners away from the grand hotels, and even persuaded her to eat heartier meals, though her lifelong anxiety about her figure never fully released its hold. He was gregarious and sometimes impulsive, fond of nightclubs and the company of lively friends. She was still shy at heart, prone to melancholy beneath the practiced smiles. The contrast drew them together at first, her fragility evoking his protective side, his exuberance stirring in her a long-buried desire to feel young and ordinary. Yet the same differences that made the romance sparkle in headlines sowed the seeds of discord. Brenda had been raised to seek security in status and to measure herself against the severe expectations of her mother and the press. Shipwreck, for all his charm, had little patience for the endless ceremonies of café society or the calculating whispers of social matrons. He enjoyed the spotlight, but chafed at the idea of living as a prop in someone else's fairy tale. Their courtship, played out in clubs like El Morocco and at summer parties in Newport, looked effortless in photographs. The tall, athletic beau, leaning toward the slim, dark-haired beauty in her strapless gown. Yet behind the smiles there were already signs that they were two people, hoping to find in the other what neither could quite give. Older viewers may recall that decades later, the world would fix a similar romantic glow on the courtship of Princess Diana and Prince Charles, reading into every smile a promise of salvation for an institution hungering for new fairy tales. In truth, as in Brenda's case, the union joined two very different temperaments under the glare of expectation. And in our own time, we continue to watch such matches in politics and celebrity culture. Women admired as symbols and partners, measured by the height to which they can lift a public image. Brenda entered marriage with Shipwreck Kelly, believing that, at last, she had found a man who loved the girl beneath the debutante's facade. For a brief season, the pairing of the graceful society beauty and the golden athlete looked like the happy ending to her story. But the habits born of a childhood spent striving for approval. The self-doubt, the rigid need to appear perfect, the quiet dependence on pills and drink to quiet her nerves did not vanish at the altar. As the public's fascination shifted to other debutantes and new wartime headlines, the strains within the marriage deepened. By the early 1940s, the fairy tale had worn thin, and the applause that had once seemed to promise safety was gone. Brenda, still only in her early 20s, was already facing the cracks in the story she had been told to live, and the descent had only just begun. The wedding photographs in the spring of 1941 gave the public a comforting illusion that Brenda Frazier, once the fragile debutante of the Waldorf-Astoria, had finally found a safe harbor. She appeared radiant in a simple satin gown, her dark hair swept back with a hint of youthful softness. Beside her stood Shipwreck Kelly, the former football star with the broad shoulders, quick grin, and the unstudied charm of a man who had earned his reputation on the field rather than in the drawing rooms of New York. For a country entering the strain of wartime, their union looked like a fairy tale of beauty and vigor. For a little while, it even felt that way. Brenda, so long trapped in the stiff rituals of café society, and was drawn to Shipwreck's relaxed humor and his preference for ordinary pleasures. He introduced her to a circle of friends far removed from the social pages, men who talked about sports and business instead of lineage and legacy. They sometimes skipped the grand dinners to catch a ball game at the polo grounds. or to drive along the Hudson on a Sunday afternoon with the windows rolled down. In those moments, Brenda could taste the ordinary happiness she had never known in her carefully staged youth. She once joked to a friend that she was finally allowed to eat more than a lettuce leaf, without feeling she was breaking some unspoken rule of society. But the very differences that drew them together slowly became fault lines. Shipwreck wanted a wife who was playful, easy to laugh, unconcerned with the rigid expectations of society columns. Brenda, for all her longing for normalcy, had been shaped by those expectations by years of being told that her worth depended on how she looked, what she wore, and who admired her. The habits of self-scrutiny, of dieting and sedatives to stay slender and serene, did not disappear simply because she had married a man of the world. The early months of their marriage were a mix of tenderness and unease. There were cozy nights by the fire in their Manhattan apartment, with Shipwreck teasing her about her obsession with fashion magazines. And there were arguments when he stayed out late with friends, or when she shrank from the noisy informality of his old teammates. The war years added strain. Shipwreck took on work in insurance and government service, often away from home, while Brenda remained in New York, still treated by the press as a public ornament rather than a private woman. A deeper wound came with the loss of their first child in infancy. Brenda, who had hoped motherhood might give her the sense of belonging she had always lacked, fell into a quiet despair. Shipwreck tried to be supportive, but his brisk, practical nature could not reach the depths of her grief. In time, she drifted back toward the world. She knew the late-night parties, the champagne, the little white pills that dulled her nerves. The marriage, already stretched by difference of temperament, began to fray. The war years brought a harsher climate for such personal dramas. While other women rolled up their sleeves to work in factories or serve as nurses, Brenda retreated into the world she knew: nightclubs, late parties, a circle of acquaintances whose names appeared more often in gossip columns than in the news of the day. By the late 1940s, the world that had first crowned Brenda was itself vanishing. The debutante season faded into irrelevance as young women went to college, worked in wartime industries, and imagined futures of their own. Café society still sparkled at the Stork Club and El Morocco, but its glamour looked increasingly like a relic of a bygone age. Brenda, still haunting those dimly lit clubs in slender gowns that now hung a little too loose on her frame, seemed to the press both beautiful and strangely out of time, a living photograph of the pre-war years. The marriage limped on for a decade, sustained by duty and the shared responsibility for their surviving daughter, Victoria. Behind the photographs of the couple at charity galas lay long silences at home, unspoken resentments, and Brenda's increasing reliance on sedatives and alcohol. Shipwreck longed for a steadier domestic life. Brenda could not surrender the only identity she had ever known, the beautiful girl in the spotlight, admired yet forever insecure. In 1951 they separated, and by the mid-1950s the divorce was final. For Brenda, it was more than the loss of a husband. It was the collapse of the last illusion that fame, applause, or even a good man's love could mend the wounds of her early years. She entered middle age as a single mother, her health undermined by years of harsh dieting and pills, her reputation diminished to the status of a cautionary tale. Older viewers will remember the changing temper of those years, the shift from pre-war café society to post-war pragmatism, and may recognize in this marriage a conflict that still echoes today, the clash between the image a woman is taught to project and the inner life she struggles to build. The descent that had begun in the glare of the Waldorf-Astoria chandeliers was gathering speed, and its shadow was about to reach the next generation. Victoria Kelly was born into a world already heavy with unspoken sorrow. For the first few years of her life, she knew her father as a cheerful presence who would scoop her up in his arms. But even in childhood, she sensed the unease that hung over her mother. Brenda loved her daughter in her own way, with sudden bursts of tenderness, expensive gifts, and elaborate birthday parties, yet she could never quite give the steady warmth that Victoria needed. The habits formed in Brenda's own neglected childhood could not easily be unlearned. She remained, as one family friend would later recall, a girl playing at being a grown-up, brittle and anxious, quick to retreat behind a bright smile when the old doubts stirred. As Victoria grew old enough to notice the rhythm of her home, she came to understand that her parents were not like the other parents she saw at school. Her father was often absent, working long hours or traveling for business. Her mother, even in the privacy of their apartment, kept the routines of a society figure, fussing over her appearance before breakfast, scanning the gossip columns as if they were a report card. At night, there were the parties that went on past her bedtime, the faint smell of cigarettes and perfume lingering in the hallway, the sound of voices raised in brittle laughter or, sometimes, in anger. The child sensed that love in her house was conditional, that affection could be withdrawn as swiftly as it was bestowed. Psychologists today call it intergenerational trauma, the passing of wounds from one generation to the next, not by genetics, but by the silent lessons of family life. A parent who has never known security often cannot give it. A parent raised to believe that worth depends on charm, beauty, and applause tends to raise a child who grows up measuring herself by the same fragile yardstick. In Brenda's case, the very patterns she had resented in her own mother were repeated almost unconsciously. The emotional distance, the restless search for validation, the swings between indulgence and cold withdrawal. Victoria's childhood unfolded in the long shadow of her mother's public image. Reporters still liked to photograph them together, the famous debutante and her little girl, but the pictures did not show the nights when Brenda shut herself in her room with a bottle and a box of pills. At school, Victoria was sometimes teased for her mother's reputation, at other times envied for the same reason. She grew up unsure whether she was loved for herself or merely pitied as the daughter of a fallen beauty. For viewers today who remember the headlines about royal marriages or the tabloid scrutiny of women like Princess Diana, there is something hauntingly familiar in Victoria's position. Like the sons and daughters of public figures in our own time, children who grow up with cameras turned toward them before they have had a chance to define themselves. Victoria had to navigate the double burden of expectation and pity. The world still thought of her as Brenda Frazier's little girl, even as she entered her teens and struggled to carve out her own identity. The tragedy is that Brenda herself once vowed to be a different kind of mother, to give her child the stability she had been denied. But the unresolved grief, the loneliness, and the dependence on sedatives all eroded that promise. When the marriage to shipwreck Kelly ended, the home grew quieter, but not gentler. The little girl who had already lost the daily presence of her father now learned to tiptoe around her mother's moods, to comfort her when the glamorous mask slipped. Historians often remark that the post-war decades brought new opportunities for American women: education, careers, a voice in public life. Yet for Victoria, those changes came too late to alter the private legacy she had inherited. She was raised at the edge of two eras, one fading, one not yet fully arrived. In that uncertain space, she bore the imprint of the old café society ideal. the daughter of a woman celebrated for her beauty, but never secure in herself. We do not know every detail of Victoria's inner life, and perhaps we never will. But the outlines are clear enough to show the pattern. The glamour that had once been hailed as a blessing had become, for the next generation, a burden. The story of Brenda Frazier was not just about a single woman's fall from grace. It was about how the weight of an era's expectations can shape a family for decades. And so, as the 1950s moved into the 1960s, the spotlight that had once dazzled Brenda faded almost entirely, but its after-image remained in her daughter's eyes. The stage was set for the final, quieter chapters of a life that had once seemed destined for legend. Yet the question lingered for all who watched from afar. Could the daughter break free of the shadow that had consumed the mother, or was the pattern too deeply engraved to escape? Bisisachan. By the time the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the woman once called the glamour girl of the century had become a ghost of her former image. The cafes and clubs that had once clamoured for her presence had long since moved on to new faces. Photographers no longer waited at her door. In her later years, she lived quietly in a small apartment, her health undermined by decades of harsh dieting, the long reliance on sedatives and alcohol, and the unhealed wounds of a fractured life. Friends described her as shy and often gentle in private, but still haunted by the old fears, the fear of being ignored, of losing the only identity she had ever known. For most of the public, she had already become a faint memory, recalled now and then in a newspaper feature about the vanished days of cafe society. She sometimes granted interviews, speaking with a mix of candor and regret about the perils of early fame. In those conversations there was little bitterness, only a quiet bewilderment at how a moment of such glitter in youth had led to so many lonely years. The public image had been frozen in time, the radiant debutante of 1938, while the woman herself grew older, frailer, more human. In the summer of 1971, Brenda Frazier died in her sleep at the age of 56. There was no grand farewell, no front-page obituary. The news appeared in brief notices on the inside pages of a few newspapers. Some older readers, seeing her name, paused to remember the girl who had once graced the cover of Life magazine and wondered how it had all gone so wrong. Younger generations, hearing of her passing, scarcely recognized the name at all. For those who had followed her life from the heights of the Waldorf-Astoria ballroom to the quiet end in a modest apartment, her death carried the weight of a cautionary tale. It revealed how fame, when built on youth and beauty alone, can be as fleeting as the season's fashion, and how the hunger for public approval, once instilled in a child, can outlast the applause itself. Older viewers today may remember the lesson their own parents taught them, that wealth and notoriety do not always bring happiness, that the applause of the crowd cannot heal private wounds. In a sense, Brenda's story marked the end of a chapter in American social history. The debutante culture that had crowned her in 1938 was already fading when she died. By the early 1970s, the women who shaped the nation's future were no longer being presented at balls. They were entering universities, workplaces, and even the halls of politics. Yet, the deeper pattern, the temptation to measure a woman's worth by her youth, her looks, and her marriage has proved harder to leave behind. As we look back, it is not the lavish dresses or the glittering parties that linger, but the image of a woman caught in a role written for her by others, first by a determined mother, then by society at large, and finally by her own unrelenting memories. The story reminds us that when a culture prizes the surface above the soul, it risks breaking the very people it sets on a pedestal. And as we reflect on the end of Brenda Frazier's journey, we are led naturally to consider the next part of the story, the world around her, the public that once adored her and then turned away, and the new generations of women who would face similar pressures in different guises. The question is not only what destroyed Brenda Frazier, but what her life can teach us about the cost of a fame that consumes the person beneath the image. In the late 1930s, the world first knew Brenda Frazier as a face in the papers, smiling above the fold of the New York Times Society pages, then radiant on the cover of Life magazine in 1938. That image of the 17-year-old debutante in the strapless main-bouger gown was as carefully staged as a royal portrait. What the public rarely considered was how such images, repeated in papers and magazines across the country, could shape a young woman's sense of self. For Brenda, every compliment, every headline, every photograph became a confirmation that her worth lay in the approval of the crowd. The press of the 1930s and 40s was gentler in tone than the paparazzi of later decades, but it shared the same hunger for novelty and spectacle. Columnists wrote about her as if she were a character in a serialized romance, the girl who embodied the glamour of a tired decade at the close of the Great Depression. When she stumbled, they recorded the stumble with the same relish as they had celebrated her triumphs. The cameras that had once followed her onto the dance floor followed her later as she left nightclubs unsteady from drink or entered hospitals for treatment. By the late 1940s and early 50s, the gossip columns of Walter Winchell and others were as relentless as modern social media. Photographers waited outside the Stork Club, not just for presidents and actors, but for fallen society beauties. Each unflattering snapshot, a tired face in the morning light. A too thin frame in a wrinkled dress became a kind of public verdict. The girl who had once symbolized grace was now described in headlines as a cautionary figure. Older viewers will recall how this cycle repeated itself in later decades. The paparazzi that hounded Princess Diana in the 1980s and 90s were heirs to the same appetite. Even today, the constant gaze of cameras and the sharpness of online commentaries create the same paradox. To be admired is to live under a spotlight that magnifies every misstep. In Brenda's time, there were fewer cameras but no less curiosity, and no mercy for the woman who could not remain eternally young. The lesson is not merely about the press. It is about the crowd that consumes the stories the press provides. Café society itself depended on that hunger, the desire of ordinary people to read about the glamorous few, to admire them, and then to judge them when they fell. Brenda's tragedy was to be caught between that admiration and that judgment, never allowed to step down from the pedestal even after the pedestal had been kicked away. Historians note that her later interviews sometimes carried a trace of quiet defiance. She would say that she had been treated as a commodity, that no one had ever really wanted to know the person behind the image. There was truth in that. But the public seldom heard it. They preferred the more familiar story of a beauty who had squandered her gifts. The myth proved more enduring than the woman. The grinding wheel of attention that lifted Brenda in 1938 and then ground her down in the decades that followed is not just a feature of history. It is the same wheel that still turns today, from the ballrooms of old New York to the glare of the red carpet, from the flashbulbs to the unblinking lens of the phone camera. It turns because the crowd keeps it turning. As we look back on her life, the question arises: was Brenda destroyed by her own weaknesses? or by a culture that taught her to measure herself only by what the crowd saw. The truth, as with many such lives, lies somewhere in between, in the meeting point of personal fragility and public appetite. And it is in that meeting point that her story finds its lasting relevance, warning us that the fascination with beauty and fame often conceals a quiet complicity in another person's undoing. Restrained Princess Diana, first shown to the world as a shy kindergarten assistant, was transformed into the radiant people's princess by the same kind of public gaze. Like Brenda, she was young when she was thrust into a role that offered status but demanded the surrender of privacy. Both women were cherished for their beauty and poise, and then criticized, often with unkind fascination, when they faltered or revealed their pain. The cameras that followed Diana into Paris in 1997 were the inheritors of the flashbulbs that had followed Brenda into the Waldorf-Astoria ballroom. Even in our own century, the pattern persists in subtler forms. Consider the way the media has framed women who marry into power and wealth figures as different as Jacqueline Kennedy in the 1960s or Melania Trump in the early 2000s. The story still often begins with an image: the beautiful bride beside the powerful man. The narrative still hovers on appearance, grace, and the supposed contrast between the glamorous woman and the hard world she enters. The expectation that a woman's image can elevate her husband's status remains a persistent theme, as if history has only changed its costumes, not its script. What Brenda's story reveals, in the clearest and most sobering way, is that when a society trains its daughters to be ornaments first and persons second, it places them at risk. The applause they receive in youth does not prepare them for the solitude of age, or for the complexity of marriage, or for the task of raising children. It leaves them vulnerable to the sharp turn of public opinion, admired one season, judged the next. In cultural memory, Brenda is no longer the glamour girl of the century, is owned-eyed. She is remembered instead as a figure who stood at the turning point between two eras, the last celebrated debutante of café society and the first to show, by her own tragic life, the hidden cost of being made into a symbol. The lessons drawn from her story were not enough to spare those who came after her. The fascination with youth and fame proved stronger than the warnings. For viewers who have lived long enough to see these cycles repeat, from the high society weddings of the 1940s to the royal romances of the late 20th century, and into the influencer culture of today, Brenda's story carries a sense of déjà vu. It reminds us that the pressures that shaped her life were not merely of her time. They are part of a larger pattern in which beauty and fame can be both a crown and a burden. And it challenges us to ask whether we have truly learned to value the person behind the image. If the world remembers Brenda Frazier now, it is not for the parties she attended or the jewels she wore. It is as a cautionary echo, a voice from the past that warns of what can happen when a young life is defined by a fleeting idea of perfection. She belongs to history not only as a symbol of a bygone society, but as a reminder that history's lessons, if unheeded, tend to repeat themselves in new guises. When we trace the arc of Brenda Frazier's life from the glitter of the Waldorf-Astoria ballroom in 1938 to the quiet passing in a modest apartment in 1971, we see more than the biography of one woman. We see the shadow of an old pattern, the way societies lift up young women as symbols, ask them to embody ideals of beauty and grace, then measure their worth by those fleeting qualities and cast them aside when time and circumstance change. The story does not belong to one century or one city. It has echoed across eras, from the salons of the Gilded Age to the tabloid era of the late 20th century, and even into the age of the influencer. We may remember the promises of progress that came with each new generation, that women would no longer be judged only by appearance, that marriage would not be treated as an alliance of beauty and wealth, that fame would not require the sacrifice of private dignity. Yet as we look back on the last century, we see the promise only half fulfilled. The stage keeps changing, but the play too often follows the same script. The life of Brenda Frazier is a reminder that history rarely moves in a straight line. It circles back, testing whether a culture has truly learned from its own tragedies. Her fate suggests that the answer is often no. The forces that shaped her, the hunger for display, the power of image over substance, the willingness of crowds to admire and then discard, still linger beneath new fashions and new technologies. And so we close her story not with the distant curiosity of gossip, but with the sober recognition of a pattern that endures. In her, we see the cost of teaching daughters to measure themselves by how the world sees them. We see the cost of training sons and husbands to value women, chiefly for the prestige they confer. We see the cost of a public that admires vulnerability only long enough to turn it into entertainment. The final question is one that reaches across generations. If even now we still reward the same surface graces and judge the same human frailties, how many more women and how many more families will have to live through the same cycle before we learn to measure worth by something deeper than beauty, wealth, or the approval of the crowd? Well knows, history often remembers the great victories and disasters, yet the quieter tragedies sometimes teach us the most enduring lessons. Brenda Frazier's life began with all the appearances of success. The daughter of privilege, the celebrated debutante in 1938, the girl on the cover of Life magazine, whose smile seemed to promise a charmed future. But beneath the chandeliers and the headlines lay the same wounds that many families know in quieter forms: a childhood starved of love, the longing to be enough, the mistake of believing that applause can fill the emptiness of the heart. In telling her story, we see how fame and wealth, without a foundation of steady affection and purpose, can become a fragile shell. We see how a society's gaze can shape a life, first offering adoration, then sharpening into criticism, and finally turning away in indifference. Her early glitter became a burden not only for herself, but also for her daughter, Victoria, who grew up in the shadow of a legend that was already fading. Older viewers who lived through the mid-20th century may remember the world she once embodied. The velvet ropes at the Waldorf-Astoria, the flash of cameras at the Stork Club, the glossy photographs in Life that made strangers feel they knew her. You may also remember how many times the pattern has repeated since then in royal weddings, in the lives of Hollywood stars, in the scrutinized marriages of political leaders. The story changes its costume, but the theme remains. Brenda Frazier's life leaves us with an image that is as much a warning as a memory. The image of a young woman dressed for a ball, standing in a circle of light, admired by thousands yet unseen for who she truly was. It asks a question that is still unsettled. If our culture continues to prize beauty, youth, and spectacle above character and kindness, how many more will live and die in the same shadowed pattern? Perhaps the truest measure of progress is not how dazzlingly we can present our daughters to the world, but whether we can give them the sense that they are valued even when the world looks away. Differently.